The summer of 1883 didn't arrive in Red Hollow, Texas. It invaded. Heat came in waves that shimmered off the hardpan earth like something alive and vengeful. Crops that had struggled through spring gave up entirely by June. Cattle stood motionless in whatever shade they could find, ribs visible through hide, tongues swollen. The creek that ran behind the settlement slowed to a trickle, then to scattered pools of warm mud that stank of rot and desperation. People prayed. Then they stopped praying and started surviving. And survival in Red Hollow had always followed a very particular hierarchy. If you owned land, you had options. If you had family with money, you had credit. If you had a husband with a reputation, you had protection. Lenore Cade had none of these things. She had a falling-down cabin at the edge of town where the road turned to nothing, 2 boys who were growing too fast on too little food, and a reputation that had curdled years ago into something she couldn't wash off no matter how hard she scrubbed. The cabin leaned. That was the first thing anyone noticed. The south wall had settled at an angle that made the whole structure look drunk, and the porch sagged in the middle like a broken back. Lenore had tried to prop it up with stones and scrap lumber, but every winter pulled it down a little more, and every summer baked the wood a little drier. Inside, the place was clean in the way poor places are clean, scrubbed past the point of logic, because cleanliness was one of the few dignities left that didn't cost money. The floor was swept. The dishes were stacked. The quilts on the beds were patched so many times they looked like maps of somewhere broken, but still holding together. It was Tuesday morning, and Lenora stood at the iron stove that dominated one corner of the single room, trying to make breakfast out of ingredients that had stopped being ingredients 3 days ago. 1 biscuit, half a tin of lard that had gone soft in the heat, a handful of cornmeal she'd stretched with water until it barely held together. She could hear her son stirring behind her. Caleb first. He always woke before Finn, always moved quietly like he was trying not to take up space. Then Finn's voice, high and still shaped by sleep. "Caleb, you stepped on my blanket." "I didn't." "You did. Now it's all twisted." "Then untwist it." Lenore didn't turn around. She broke the biscuit into 3 pieces with her hands, arranged them on 2 tin plates, and set the plates on the table that wobbled unless you knew which leg to avoid. Caleb appeared first, 12 years old and already carrying the posture of someone much older. His hair stuck up in the back, dark and coarse like his father's had been. He wore trousers that stopped above his ankles and a shirt Lenora had let out twice until there was no more fabric to let. He glanced at the plates, then at his mother. "You already ate?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. It was a test. Lenora smiled, quick and false. "I did. Had some cornmeal earlier." Liar. The word came from Finn, who had climbed onto the chair beside his brother and was staring at the biscuit piece like it was something rare and breakable. "Finn?" Lenora said, her voice carrying the kind of warning mothers learn to deliver without raising volume. "She is," Finn insisted. He was 7, small for his age, with a face that still looked soft in the way children's faces do before hardship carves them into something sharper. "She always says she ate already, but she didn't." Caleb picked up his piece of biscuit and broke it in half. He slid 1 portion back toward the center of the table. "I'm not that hungry," he said. Lenora felt something crack inside her chest. Not loud, not dramatic, just a hairline fracture in a structure already holding too much weight. "Caleb, I'm not," he said again, and the firmness in his voice, the way he refused to look at her, made her stop arguing. Finn ate his piece slowly, chewing each bite longer than necessary to make it last. Caleb ate half of his and wrapped the other half in a rag, tucking it into his pocket. "For later," he said. Lenora turned back to the stove so they wouldn't see her face. Later, there would be nothing. Later, there would be the same nothing they'd had yesterday and the day before. Later, she would walk into town with a basket of laundry she'd taken in from the Penner family, collect her coins, and try to stretch them across debts that had already stretched past breaking. She didn't say any of this. She said, "I'm going into town this morning. You boys stay close to the cabin." "Why?" Finn asked. "Because I said so." "But why?" "Finn," Caleb's voice again, low and certain. "Leave it." Finn looked at his brother, then back at his mother, and something in the air made him go quiet. Lenora pulled on her bonnet, faded blue, brim fraying, and picked up the laundry basket. It was heavier than it should have been. Everything was heavier than it should have been. "I'll be back before noon," she said. Caleb nodded. Finn kicked his feet against the chair legs, and Lenora stepped out into the heat. The walk into Red Hollow took 20 minutes if you kept a steady pace. Lenora didn't keep a steady pace. She kept a deliberate one. Head up, shoulders back, eyes forward. She had learned a long time ago that the moment you started looking at the ground was the moment people decided you deserved to be walked over. The town itself wasn't much. A main street with a dozen buildings that pretended to be permanent, a church that needed paint, a general store that extended credit to everyone except people like her. There was a saloon that opened too early and closed too late, a land office that processed claims for people who could afford lawyers, and a sheriff's office that enforced laws selectively. Lenora could feel eyes on her before she reached the first building. Women paused mid-conversation as she passed. Men glanced over, then looked away like she was something indecent. A group of children playing near the church stopped their game and stared. She kept walking. The Penner house sat at the north end of town, 2 stories of whitewashed wood and glass windows that caught the sun. Mrs. Penner answered the door herself, which meant the housekeeper was busy. "You're late," Mrs. Penner said. Lenora wasn't late. She was exactly on time. But she didn't argue. "I have your laundry," she said, holding up the basket. Mrs. Penner inspected the contents without taking the basket, lifting each folded piece with 2 fingers like she was checking for contamination. "The collar on Mr. Penner's shirt still has a mark." Lenora looked. There was no mark. "I'll rewash it," she said. "See that you do." Mrs. Penner reached into her apron and pulled out a handful of coins. She counted them twice before placing them in Lenora's hand. "That's for last week, and this week both. You're caught up now." It wasn't enough for 2 weeks. It was barely enough for 1. "Mrs. Penner, you're caught up," the woman repeated, and closed the door. Lenora stood on the porch, staring at the coins in her palm. She counted them 3 times, hoping the number would change. It didn't. She turned and walked back toward Main Street. The general store was her next stop. She needed flour, lard, something to stretch into meals that would keep her sons from asking questions she couldn't answer. The store smelled like sawdust and coffee, and the vague sweetness of dried fruit nobody could afford. Mr. Harlan stood behind the counter, thick-armed and balding, with the expression of a man who had long ago stopped pretending to care about anyone's problems but his own. "Mrs. Cade," he said. Not a greeting, just an acknowledgement. "Mr. Harlan." She set the coins on the counter. "I need flour. And lard if you have it." He looked at the coins, then at her. "No credit," he said. I'm not asking for credit. I have money." Not enough. Lenora felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the weather. "I have enough for flour." Prices went up. "Since when?" "Since now." She stared at him. He stared back. From somewhere behind her, a voice, female, low, amused, said, "Just give her the flour, Harlan. It's not worth the fuss." Lenora turned. A woman stood near the shelves, dressed in a riding outfit that probably cost more than Lenora made in 6 months. She was younger than Lenora, maybe 30, with dark hair pinned under a hat that had actual feathers in it. Mrs. Gideon Rusk, the wife of the man who owned half the county and controlled the other half through lawyers, land grabs, and carefully applied pressure. "Mrs. Rusk," Harlan said quickly, his tone shifting into something deferential. "I didn't see you come in." Clearly. She picked up a tin of something from the shelf and examined it without interest. "The woman needs flour. Sell her the flour." Harlan's jaw worked. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a small sack, thudding it onto the wood. "That'll be all your coins," he said. Lenora swept them forward without a word. Mrs. Rusk moved toward the door, pausing as she passed Lenora. "You're the washerwoman?" she said. Not a question. "I am." "You live out past the bend, that little cabin." "Yes." Mrs. Rusk studied her for a moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "My husband mentioned you," she said quietly. Lenora went very still. "Did he?" "He's acquiring land in that area, expanding operations." Mrs. Rusk adjusted her gloves, her tone casual in the way dangerous things often are. "I'd imagine that cabin of yours sits on property he's interested in." The air in the store seemed to tighten. "The cabin's mine," Lenora said. "I'm sure it is." Mrs. Rusk smiled, thin and precise. "For now." Then she walked out, boots clicking against the floorboards. Lenora stood there, gripping the sack of flour, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over her like a shroud. Harlan cleared his throat. "Anything else?" he asked. She shook her head and left. By the time Lenora reached the edge of town, the sun had climbed high enough to bake the dirt road into something hard and unforgiving. She walked slowly, flour sack tucked under one arm, mind circling the same questions over and over. Gideon Rusk was interested in her land. Why? It was worthless. A patch of scrub and dust with a cabin that barely stood. There was no water, no minerals, nothing anyone would want, unless it wasn't about what the land had, unless it was about what someone could build there. She thought about the railroad rumors, the talk of expansion routes cutting through the county, the whispers of investors from back east looking for cheap property to develop. If the railroad came through, if it ran anywhere near her cabin, that worthless patch of dirt would suddenly be worth something. And men like Gideon Rusk didn't wait for land to become valuable. They took it before anyone else realized what it was worth. Lenora's grip on the flour sack tightened. She had a deed, old, water-stained, stored in a tin box under her bed. Her husband had filed it years ago, back when he still pretended their marriage was something that would last. The deed was legal, the land was hers, but legality only mattered if the people enforcing it cared. And in Red Hollow, the people who enforced things were usually the same people who benefited from ignoring them. She was still thinking about this when she crested the last rise and saw the cabin in the distance, and the horse tied to her porch railing. Lenora stopped. The horse was tall, dark, well-kept, the kind of animal that spoke of money and care. Beside it, standing in the shade of the overhang, was a man. Not young, not old. Somewhere in the hard middle years where age stopped being a number and became a condition. He wore a duster coat despite the heat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and he stood with the kind of stillness that came from years of waiting without complaint. Caleb and Finn were on the porch steps, watching him. Lenora's heart kicked once, hard. She walked faster. By the time she reached the cabin, the man had turned toward her. His face was weathered, lined deep around the eyes and mouth, with a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and healed crooked. He didn't smile. He just looked at her. "Mrs. Cade," he said. His voice was low, rough-edged, not threatening, just factual. "Who are you?" Lenora asked. "Silas Mercer." The name meant nothing to her. "What do you want?" He glanced at the boys, then back at her. "I brought some things," he said. "What things?" Silas gestured toward the porch. Lenora followed his hand and saw them, packages wrapped in brown paper and twine, stacked neatly beside the door. Flour, cured meat, preserves in glass jars, a small tin that looked like it held butter. Her stomach twisted. "I don't know you," she said carefully. "No, ma'am." "So why are you bringing me food?" Silas didn't answer right away. He looked at the cabin, at the sagging porch, at the boys still watching him with wide eyes. Then he looked back at Lenora. "Because you need it," he said. The simplicity of the answer felt like a trap. Lenora had learned long ago that men didn't give things without expecting something back. Help came with prices, some named up front, some hidden until you were already in debt. "I don't take charity," she said. "It's not charity." "Then what is it?" Silas adjusted his hat, shadows shifting across his face. "It's food," he said. "Your boys are thin. You're thinner. And I have more than I need." Finn made a small sound, hopeful, hungry, and Lenora shot him a look that made him go quiet. "I don't know what you think this is," she said slowly, "but I'm not interested." "In what?" "In whatever arrangement you're imagining." Something flickered across Silas's face. Not offense, something sadder. "I'm not imagining an arrangement," he said. "I'm leaving food." "Why?" "Because I can." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." They stared at each other. Lenora wanted to throw the packages back at him, wanted to tell him to take his pity and his mysterious intentions and ride back to wherever he came from. But Finn was staring at the jars of preserves like they were something holy. And Caleb was watching her with that look, The one that said he knew exactly how little food they had left and exactly how long it wouldn't last. Lenora's jaw tightened. "If I take this," she said quietly, "it doesn't mean anything." "All right, it doesn't mean you're owed anything. I understand. And if you come back here expecting something, I won't," Silas said. He untied his horse, swung up into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd been doing it his entire life, and looked down at her one last time. "Ma'am," he said. A nod. Not quite a goodbye. Then he rode away. Lenora stood in the yard watching him disappear down the road, flour sack still tucked under her arm. Finn was already on the porch, examining the packages with reverent hands. "Mama, look, there's jam and meat and... Caleb, look at this." Caleb didn't move. He was watching his mother. "Who was that?" he asked. Lenora shook her head. "I don't know." "Are we keeping it?" She looked at the packages, at her son's, at the flour sack that wouldn't last the week. "Yes," she said finally. Finn whooped. Caleb's shoulders dropped an inch, and Lenora carried the flour inside, set it on the table, and tried to ignore the feeling that something had just shifted. Something she didn't understand yet. Something that felt dangerous and necessary all at once. That night, they ate better than they had in weeks. Lenora fried slices of the cured meat in the skillet until the fat rendered and the edges crisped. She opened one of the jars, fig preserves, dark and thick, and spread it on the leftover biscuit pieces. Finn ate until his stomach hurt, and even Caleb allowed himself a second helping. Afterward, the boys lay on their bed in the corner, talking in low voices about the stranger and the horse and whether he'd come back. Lenora sat at the table, the tin of berry butter open in front of her. She hadn't touched it yet. It sat there pale and smooth, smelling faintly of summer fruit and something sweeter she couldn't name. She thought about Silas Mercer, about the way he'd stood on her porch like he belonged there, even though he didn't, about the way he'd looked at her boys, not with pity, but with something quieter. Recognition, maybe. About the way he'd answered her questions without defensiveness, without expectation. Because you need it. Lenora dipped her finger into the butter and tasted it. It was perfect, and that, somehow, made it worse. She closed the tin, set it aside, and stared out the window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, Silas Mercer was riding back to wherever he came from, and Lenora Cade was sitting in a cabin that wasn't quite hers anymore, not if Gideon Rusk decided he wanted it. She thought about Mrs. Rusk's words. For now. She thought about the flour sack on the counter and the packages on the porch and the stranger who had appeared without explanation. And she thought about the fire that hadn't happened yet, the one that would come later, the one that would burn everything. But tonight, her sons were full. Tonight, the cabin was quiet. And tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lenora Cade allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, that maybe the world hadn't already decided what she was worth. Maybe there was still something left to fight for. She just didn't know yet what that fight would cost. Silas Mercer returned 3 days later. Lenora saw him coming from the window where she stood washing the breakfast dishes. What few there were. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet, and the morning air still held that brief coolness that would burn off within the hour. She watched the distant figure on horseback grow clearer, recognized the shape of him, and felt her jaw tighten. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. Caleb was already outside, feeding the 2 scrawny chickens they kept in a makeshift pen. He looked up at the approaching rider, then at his mother. "It's him," he said. "I see that. You want me to—" "Oh, no. Go inside with your brother." "Mama, inside, Caleb." The boy hesitated, then set down the feed bucket and disappeared through the door. Lenora heard him telling Finn to stay quiet, heard Finn's protesting whisper. She waited. Silas rode up slowly, like he had all the time in the world and no particular concern about how he was received. When he reached the cabin, he dismounted without ceremony and tied his horse to the same rail as before. "Mr. Mercer," Lenora said. Her voice was flat, deliberately empty of welcome. "Mrs. Cade." He touched the brim of his hat. "Morning." "It's early." "Yes, ma'am." "I wasn't expecting you." "I imagine not." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out another bundle, smaller this time. He set it on the porch step without coming any closer. Lenora looked at it, then at him. I told you last time, she said. I'm not taking charity. And I told you it's not charity. Then what do you call showing up at someone's home uninvited with packages you won't explain? Silas tilted his head slightly, studying her. I call it bringing food to people who need it. We're managing fine. You're not. The bluntness of it knocked something loose in Lenora's chest. She felt heat rise in her face, anger, embarrassment, both tangled together. You don't know anything about how we're managing, she said. I know your boys are wearing clothes that don't fit. I know this porch is about 6 months from collapsing. I know you walked into town 3 days ago and came back with 1 sack of flour and nothing else. Lenora went very still. You've been watching me? No. Silas's expression didn't change. I've been paying attention. There's a difference. Not much of one. There is if you're honest about it. She wanted to tell him to leave, wanted to throw his package back at him and demand he stop inserting himself into her life like he had any right to be there. But the truth was sitting on the porch step in brown paper and twine, and the truth was that her sons had been eating better since his last visit than they had in months. Silas seemed to sense her hesitation. He stepped back toward his horse. I'm not here to cause you trouble, he said quietly. I'm just here. Why? He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, something old and tired and maybe a little broken. Because I should have stopped the first time I rode past, he said. And I didn't. And I'm trying to do better than that now. Then he swung back into the saddle. Lenora found her voice. Wait! He paused, reins in hand. She didn't know what she was going to say until she said it. The porch, she said. You said it's about to collapse. It is. Could you fix it? Silas looked at the sagging boards, then back at her. I could. How much would you charge? Nothing. Mr. Mercer, I'd do it for nothing, he said again. But if it makes you feel better, you can feed me while I work. That sound like a fair trade? It didn't. It sounded like another form of charity dressed up to look like something else. But Lenora was tired of fighting every small gesture like it was a declaration of war. Fine, she said. When? Tomorrow morning. I'll bring tools. He rode away before she could change her mind. Lenora stood on the porch, staring after him, wondering what kind of mistake she'd just made. Behind her, the door creaked open. Caleb stepped out. Is he coming back? He asked. Lenora picked up the package from the step. It was heavier than it looked. Yes, she said. Why? She shook her head. I genuinely don't know. Silas arrived the next morning just after dawn, a wagon rattling behind his horse loaded with lumber, tools, and a leather satchel that looked older than Lenora. Finn was instantly fascinated. He stood at the edge of the porch, watching Silas unload boards with the kind of reverence most children reserved for circus performers. Can I help? Finn asked. Silas glanced at Lenora. She gave a small nod. All right, Silas said. But you do what I say, when I say it. Understood? Yes, sir. Caleb emerged from inside, slower, more cautious. He didn't ask to help. He just watched, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Silas noticed. You know how to use a hammer? He asked. Caleb shrugged. Some. Then grab that one over there. I'll show you the rest. For the next 3 hours, Silas worked with the kind of methodical patience that came from years of building things that needed to last. He pulled up the rotted boards, measured new ones, cut them to size with a handsaw that sang through the wood like it was soft butter. And he taught. Not lecturing, not condescending, just steady instruction delivered in a voice that assumed competence and waited for it to show up. Hold the board steady, both hands. That's it. Now when I say, pull it tight against the frame. Caleb followed directions without comment, but Lenora could see something shifting in the boy's posture. The defensive hunch in his shoulders eased, his hands stopped fumbling. Finn, meanwhile, fetched nails and tools and asked approximately 900 questions. Why are you cutting it at an angle? So it fits flush against the support beam. What's a support beam? The part that holds everything else up. Why is it called that? Because that's what it does. But who named it? Silas paused, hammer mid-swing, and looked at the boy. I have no idea. Finn grinned like he'd won something. Lenora stayed inside for most of the morning, trying to give them space while also keeping an ear on the conversation. She cleaned things that didn't need cleaning, rearranged shelves, mended a tear in one of Finn's shirts. Around midday, she brought out water and cornbread. Silas accepted both without fuss. He sat on the new section of porch, solid now, level, and ate in silence while the boys sprawled in the dirt nearby. "It looks good," Lenora said, nodding toward the boards. "It'll hold." "How long?" "Long as you need it to." She wanted to ask what that meant. Wanted to ask how long he thought she'd be here, if he knew something she didn't, if the rumors about Gideon Rusk were more than rumors. Instead, she said, "Thank you." Silas looked up at her, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "You're welcome," he said. That evening, after Silas had packed his tools and ridden off with a quiet goodbye, Caleb helped Lenora clean up the wood scraps. "He's different," Caleb said. "Different how?" The boy thought about it. "He doesn't talk to me like I'm stupid." Lenora's chest tightened. "You're not stupid." "I know, but most people talk to me like I am." She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to explain that the world often mistook youth for incompetence and poverty for failure. "Mr. Mercer seems like he knows what he's doing," she said instead. Caleb nodded. "He said he'd come back tomorrow, finish the railing." "Did he?" "Yeah, is that okay?" Lenora looked at the new porch boards, at the way they sat even and strong where the old ones had sagged. "Yes," she said. "That's okay." Tim. Silas came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time he brought something, nails, brackets, a jar of linseed oil for treating the wood. Each time he worked quietly and efficiently, teaching Caleb alongside him, tolerating Finn's endless questions with the patience of someone who had long ago learned that silence wasn't the same as peace. By the end of the first week, the porch was finished. The railing was secure, the boards treated and sealed, the whole structure level for the first time in years. Silas stood back, examining his work with a critical eye. "That should do it," he said. Lenora stepped out onto the porch. It didn't creak, didn't sway, just held. "It's solid," she said. "It is." She waited for him to pack up his tools, to say goodbye, to leave now that the job was finished. He didn't. Instead, he looked at the cabin's south wall, the one that leaned at that precarious angle. "That wall's going to come down in the next bad storm," he said. Lenora followed his gaze. "I know. I could brace it. Mr. Mercer. Wouldn't take more than a day, 2 at most. You've already done enough." Silas turned to look at her. His expression was calm, unreadable. "Have I?" he asked. "Yes." "Then why does it feel like I'm just getting started?" The question hung in the air between them. Lenora didn't know how to answer it, didn't know if she wanted to. "I don't understand you," she said finally. "That makes 2 of us. You show up here, you fix things, you teach my boys, and you won't take payment, you won't explain yourself. You just keep coming back." "Yes." "Why?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. "I had a family once," he said. "A wife, a daughter. They died. Accident. 5 years ago." Lenora felt something cold settle in her stomach. "I'm sorry," she said. He shook his head. "I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because after they died, I stopped seeing people, stopped noticing. I'd ride through town, past homes, past families struggling, and I just didn't see it, didn't want to see it." He looked at her cabin, at the boys watching from the doorway. "Then one day I rode past this place," he continued. "Saw you out front, hanging laundry. Saw your boys playing in the dirt. Saw how thin you all were, how hard you were trying, and I just kept riding. Mr. Mercer, I got halfway home before I realized what I'd done," he said. "What I'd become. Someone who could see suffering and just ride past it because it was easier than stopping." The silence stretched. "So I came back," Silas said. "Not to fix you, not to save you, just to stop being the kind of man who rides past." Lenora didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know if there was anything to say. Caleb's voice broke the quiet. "You can fix the wall if you want," he called from the doorway. Silas looked at the boy, then at Lenora. "It's not up to me," he said. Lenora studied him, This strange, quiet man who had appeared in her life without explanation and refused to leave despite every reason she gave him. She thought about trust, about how hard she'd worked to stop giving it away to people who didn't deserve it. But she also thought about the porch beneath her feet, about the way Caleb's shoulders had straightened while working beside Silas, about Finn's laughter when the man answered his ridiculous questions without irritation. "All right," she said, "fix the wall." Silas nodded once. "I'll start tomorrow." Over the next 2 weeks, Silas became a fixture at the cabin. He arrived early each morning, worked through the heat of the day, and left before supper. He braced the south wall, replaced rotted window frames, patched holes in the roof that Lenora hadn't even known were there. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, the cabin stopped looking like something temporary. It started looking like a home. The boys took to Silas like he was something they'd been missing without knowing it. Finn followed him everywhere, chattering constantly, handing him tools he didn't need and asking questions about everything from why wood swelled in humidity to whether horses could swim. Silas answered every single one. Caleb was quieter but no less affected. He worked beside the man with increasing confidence, learning how to measure twice and cut once, how to read the grain of wood, how to fix things properly instead of just making them hold together a little longer. One afternoon, Lenora heard them talking while she prepared supper inside. "My pa left," Caleb said. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Lenora heard the edge underneath. 3 years ago. Just didn't come home one day." "I'm sorry," Silas said. "It's fine. We're fine." "I believe you." A pause. Then Caleb again, quieter now. "Do you think he's dead?" Lenora's hand stilled on the knife she was using to slice potatoes. "I don't know," Silas said. "Do you?" "I used to think maybe he was, that something bad happened and that's why he didn't come back. But Mama doesn't think so. She thinks he just left." "What do you think?" Caleb was quiet for so long, Lenora thought he wouldn't answer. "I think it doesn't matter," he said finally. "Dead or gone, he's not here, so I have to be." "You're doing a good job," Silas said. "I'm 12. "I know. You're still doing a good job." Lenora blinked hard and went back to cutting potatoes. That evening, after the boys had fallen asleep and Silas had long since ridden home, she sat at the table and let herself cry for the first time in months. Not because things were bad, because for the first time in years they were starting to feel like they might get better. And that terrified her more than anything. Passam. The town noticed, of course. Red Hollow was too small for secrets and too bored for discretion. Within days, everyone knew that Silas Mercer, the wealthy rancher who kept to himself on his property north of town, was spending his mornings at Lenora Cade's cabin. The gossip spread like fire in dry grass. Some said he was courting her. Others said worse. A few speculated about business arrangements that had nothing to do with business. Lenora heard the whispers when she walked into town, saw the looks, the judgment stacked on top of judgment she'd already been carrying for years. She ignored it. What else could she do? But then she ran into Sarah Pembroke outside the church one Sunday morning. Sarah was a banker's wife, well-dressed and well-liked, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about whether you'd eat that week. "Lenora," she said, her tone bright and false. "How are you?" "Fine, thank you." "I hear you've had help with your cabin. That's so fortunate." Lenora kept her expression neutral. "It is. Silas Mercer, isn't it? Such a generous man. Though I suppose people will talk." "People always talk." Sarah's smile sharpened. "Of course, but you have children to think about. Appearances matter, especially for boys. You wouldn't want them growing up with the wrong kind of reputation." Something hot and sharp flared in Lenora's chest. "My sons have a roof that doesn't leak," she said quietly, "and a porch that won't collapse under their feet. I'm not particularly concerned about appearances. I'm only saying, I know what you're saying, and I'm telling you it's none of your business." Sarah's face went tight. "Well, I suppose desperation makes people forget themselves." She walked away before Lenora could respond. Lenora stood there, hands shaking, trying to remember why she'd bothered coming to town at all. When she told Silas about it later, not because she wanted to, but because he asked why she seemed upset, he listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Do you want me to stop coming around?" "No," Lenora said, surprising herself with how quickly the answer came. "You sure?" Because I don't want to make things harder for you. Things are already hard. You fixing my cabin isn't making it worse. Silas nodded slowly. All right then. But the next day when he arrived, he didn't come alone. He brought lumber, more than he needed, enough for something bigger. What's this for? Lenore asked. Thought you might want to build something, he said. Like what? Up to you. She stared at the stack of wood, then at him. You can't just keep bringing me things, she said. Why not? Because I can't pay you back. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Silas took off his hat, wiped his forehead with his sleeve, and looked at her straight on. I'm asking if you want to build something that's yours, he said. Something that doesn't depend on charity or credit or anyone's permission. Something you make with your own hands that nobody can take from you. Lenore's throat tightened. What would I even build? I don't know. What do you know how to do? She thought about it. About the years before her husband left, when she used to help her grandmother in the smokehouse out back of their old place. About the recipes she still remembered, the techniques for curing and smoking meat that turned cheap cuts into something people would pay extra for. I know how to smoke meat, she said slowly. Silas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or respect. Then build a smokehouse, he said. That's not a small project. No, but you've got time, you've got lumber, and you've got me and Caleb to help. Why would you do that? Because I want to see what happens when you stop surviving and start building. The words hit her like something physical. She looked at the lumber, at Silas, at the cabin behind them with its straight walls and solid porch. All right, she said. Let's build a smokehouse. It took 3 weeks. They built it behind the cabin, far enough from the house that smoke wouldn't be a problem, but close enough that Lenore could tend it easily. Silas showed her how to construct the frame, how to seal the joints, how to build the firebox and the smoke chamber. Caleb worked harder than Lenore had ever seen him work. He measured boards, hauled rocks for the foundation, helped mix mortar with the focused intensity of someone proving something to himself. Finn mostly got in his way, but he did it enthusiastically. When the structure was finally finished, 4 walls, a roof, racks for hanging meat, a firebox that drew smoke up and through just right, Lenore stood back and looked at it. It wasn't beautiful. The boards were rough cut, the roof slightly uneven, but it was solid, functional. Hers. Now what? Silas asked. Lenore thought about her grandmother's recipes, about the spice blend she used to make from memory, about the way properly smoked meat could turn subsistence into something worth paying for. Now I start smoking, she said. You have meat? I will. That night she counted the coins she'd saved from laundry work. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a few chickens from the Hendersons, maybe some pork from the butcher if he was feeling generous. The next morning she walked into town with purpose instead of dread. The butcher, a gruff man named Coleman who usually treated her with polite indifference, looked surprised when she asked for pork shoulder. That's a lot of meat for one woman, he said. I'm not eating it, I'm smoking it. What for? To sell. Coleman raised an eyebrow. You going into business? Maybe. He studied her for a moment, then shrugged and cut her a fair portion at a price that didn't make her wince. Good luck, he said. Lenora carried the meat home and got to work. She prepared the brine the way her grandmother had taught her. Salt, brown sugar, herbs she'd gathered from the scrubland around the cabin. She let the meat cure for 2 days, then moved it to the smokehouse. The first time she lit the fire and watched smoke begin to curl up through the chamber, something loosened in her chest. This was hers. Not charity. Not help she couldn't repay. Something she had built with her own hands. Silas came by that afternoon and found her sitting on the ground outside the smokehouse, watching smoke drift from the vents. How's it burning? He asked. Perfect. He sat down beside her, quiet and unhurried. They stayed like that for a while, not talking, just watching smoke rise into the pale Texas sky. Finally, Lenora said, Thank you. For what? For the lumber, for the help, for... She gestured vaguely at everything. All of it. You did the work, Silas said. You made it possible. He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. You would have found a way, he said. With or without me? Maybe, but it would have taken longer. Maybe that's all help is, Silas said quietly. Making things take less time. Lenora didn't have an answer for that. 3 days later, she opened the smokehouse and pulled out the first batch of meat. It was perfect. Dark, rich, tender enough to pull apart with a fork, but firm enough to slice clean. The smoke had penetrated deep, and the spice blend her grandmother had taught her gave it a complexity that made even plain pork taste like something special. Caleb tried a piece and his eyes went wide. "Mama, this is really good." "You think so?" "I know so." That weekend, Lenora set up a small stand at the edge of her property where the road bent toward town. She hung a sign Finn had painted, "Smoked Meat," and arranged her product on a wooden board. She didn't know if anyone would stop, but within an hour, 3 people had. By noon, she'd sold everything. By the end of the week, she had regular customers. And by the end of the month, Lenora Cade had something she hadn't had in years, money she'd earned herself. Not laundering other people's clothes, not begging for credit, not accepting charity. Money from work that was hers. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And starts, Lenora was learning, mattered more than she'd ever given them credit for. But not everyone was happy about her success. Gideon Rusk heard about the smokehouse within days, heard about the roadside stand, heard about how people were driving past his businesses to buy meat from a woman who shouldn't have had the resources to compete. He didn't like it. More than that, he didn't understand it. Lenora Cade was supposed to be desperate, broken, easy to push off her land when the time came. Instead, she was building something, and that made her dangerous. Because people who built things fought harder to keep them. Rusk stood in his office, looking out the window at Red Hollow sprawled below, and made a decision. It was time to remind Lenora Cade who owned this town, and what happened to people who forgot their place. The first warning came on a Tuesday morning in the form of a man Lenora had never seen before. He arrived in a buggy, dressed too well for the heat, carrying a leather satchel that looked expensive. He didn't bother tying his horse, just climbed down, brushed dust from his coat, and walked toward the smokehouse where Lenora was checking the temperature of her latest batch. "Mrs. Cade?" he called. She turned, wiping smoke residue from her hands onto her apron. "That's me? My name is Vernon Price. I'm an attorney representing the Red Hollow Land Office." Lenora's stomach went cold. "All right." Price opened his satchel and pulled out a folded document. "I'm here to inform you that there's been a discrepancy discovered regarding your property deed." "What kind of discrepancy?" "The surveyor's original filing appears to have contained errors in the boundary markers. Upon review, it's been determined that this land," he gestured vaguely at the cabin and surrounding area, "may not actually fall within the parcel your deed describes." Lenora took the document he offered. The words swam in front of her eyes, legal language dense and impenetrable. "I don't understand," she said. "It's quite simple. Your deed may be invalid. We're giving you 30 days to vacate while the matter is investigated." "Vacate?" "Leave the property, yes." "This is my home." Price's expression didn't change. Professional, detached. "I understand this is inconvenient, Mrs. Cade, but the law is the law. You'll receive formal notice by the end of the week." He tipped his hat, climbed back into his buggy, and drove away. Lenora stood there holding the document, reading it over and over until the words stopped making any sense at all. Caleb found her 10 minutes later, still standing in the same spot. "Mama, what's wrong?" She looked at him and tried to find words that wouldn't scare him. "Nothing," she said. "It's just paperwork." But Caleb was 12, not stupid. He could read the fear on her face. "What kind of paperwork?" "The kind we'll figure out." That night, after the boys were asleep, Lenora sat at the table with the deed she kept in the tin box under her bed and the document Price had given her. She compared them line by line, trying to understand what had changed, what error could possibly make her claim invalid. She couldn't find it. The boundaries matched. The parcel number matched. Everything looked exactly the way it had when her husband filed the claim 6 years ago, which meant the error wasn't an error. It was an excuse. She thought about Mrs. Rusk's words outside the general store weeks ago, about Gideon Rusk acquiring land in the area. about how her cabin sat on property he might want. This wasn't about surveying mistakes. This was about money and power, and men who took what they wanted by making the law say whatever they needed it to say. Lenora put her head in her hands and tried to think. She had 30 days. 30 days to prove something she shouldn't have to prove, that the land her husband had legally claimed, that she'd lived on for years, that she'd nearly killed herself keeping, was actually hers. She had no lawyer, no money to hire one, no connections to anyone who could help. She had a smokehouse and 2 sons and a stranger who'd been kind to her for reasons she still didn't fully understand. The next morning, she rode into town. The land office was a narrow building wedged between the bank and a hat shop that never seemed to have customers. Inside, a clerk sat behind a desk covered in papers, looking bored. "I need to see the surveyor's records for my property," Lenora said. The clerk glanced up. "Name?" "Lenora Cade, Parcel 12, Section 4. He pulled out a massive ledger, flipped through pages, ran his finger down columns of numbers. "Says here the original survey is under review." "I know. That's why I need to see it." "Can't. It's been pulled for investigation." "By who?" "The land office." "You are the land office." The clerk's expression flattened. "The records aren't available, Mrs. Cade. Come back in 30 days. "In 30 days I won't have a home." "Then I suggest you find somewhere else to live." Lenora felt heat rise in her chest. "I have a legal deed." "So you say. It's filed with this office, and it's under review. There's nothing else I can tell you." She wanted to argue, wanted to demand access to records that should be public, wanted to force someone to explain how a claim that had been valid for 6 years suddenly wasn't. But the clerk had already gone back to his paperwork, and Lenora knew enough about how the world worked to understand when she was being dismissed. She left the office and stood on the street, trying to decide what to do next. That's when she saw Silas. He was across the street, loading supplies into his wagon outside the feed store. He looked up, saw her, and something in her expression made him set down what he was carrying and walk over. "What happened?" he asked. Lenora told him. The attorney, the notice, the land office clerk who wouldn't let her see her own records. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, his jaw was tight. "Rusk," he said. "You think so?" "I know so. He's been buying up land along the route where the railroad's supposed to run. He uses the same lawyer, Price. Same tactic. Claims there's an error in the original filing, pushes people off before they can fight it, then buys the property for nothing at auction." Lenora's hands curled into fists. "Can he do that?" "He can if nobody stops him." "How do I stop him?" Silas looked at her for a long moment. "You fight back. Get your own lawyer. Force them to prove the claim is invalid instead of just accepting it." "I can't afford a lawyer." "I can." The words hit her like cold water. "No," she said immediately. "Lenora. No, I'm not taking money from you. This isn't charity. It's exactly charity. You paying for something I can't afford because you feel sorry for me." Silas's expression hardened. "I don't feel sorry for you. I feel angry that someone's trying to steal your land." "Then be angry, but don't throw money at it like that fixes anything." "What else are you going to do?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out." She walked away before he could argue, before the temptation to accept his help could override the stubborn pride that was the only thing keeping her upright. By the time she reached her cabin, a plan was starting to form. It wasn't a good plan, but it was hers. If Gideon Rusk wanted her land, she'd make it too expensive to take. She'd build something so visible, so successful, that forcing her out would look exactly like what it was: theft. She'd make her smokehouse bigger, sell more, become someone the town couldn't ignore. And if that didn't work, at least she'd go down fighting. That afternoon, she went back to the smokehouse and started preparing twice as much meat as usual. She worked through the evening, through the night, until Caleb found her at dawn still tending the fire. "Mama, you need to sleep. I need to work. You're going to make yourself sick." "I'm going to make us safe." Caleb stared at her. "The land thing. It's bad, isn't it?" Lenora wanted to lie, wanted to tell him everything would be fine, but Caleb deserved better than lies. "Yes," she said. "It's bad. What are we going to do?" We're going to sell enough smoked meat that everyone in 3 counties knows my name. We're going to make this place matter, and we're going to make it very hard for anyone to pretend we don't exist. Caleb nodded slowly. I can help. You already do. No, I mean really help. I can run the stand, take money, keep track of what we sell. Lenora looked at her son. Too thin, too serious, too young to be talking about business like it was a matter of survival, which it was. All right, she said, we'll do it together. Over the next 2 weeks, Lenora's roadside stand went from a small operation to something that looked almost legitimate. Caleb built a proper table from scrap lumber. Finn painted a new sign with better lettering. Lenora expanded her recipes, adding different spice blends, different cuts, different smoking times that produced different flavors. Word spread. People started coming from farther away. A family from 2 towns over. A merchant who wanted to buy in bulk. A restaurant owner from the county seat who offered to carry her products. Money came in faster than Lenora had ever seen it. Not a fortune, but enough to matter, enough to save, enough to feel like maybe, just maybe, she could afford to fight. Then the inspection started. First it was the health inspector, a sweaty man named Garrett, who showed up unannounced and claimed he'd received complaints about food safety. He poked through the smokehouse, examined her methods, tested temperatures, found nothing wrong, but promised to come back. Then it was the tax assessor, asking questions about whether she had a business license, whether she was paying commercial property taxes, whether her operation qualified as agricultural or commercial. Lenora didn't have answers, didn't know she needed a license, didn't know the difference between agricultural and commercial. The assessor left her with a stack of forms and a warning that operating without proper permits could result in fines. Then came the fire marshal. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, looked at her smokehouse for exactly 3 minutes, and declared it a fire hazard. You can't operate this, he said. Why not? Insufficient clearance from the dwelling, improper ventilation, no fire suppression equipment. It's a smokehouse. It's supposed to have fire. Controlled fire. With safety measures. What kind of safety measures? He rattled off a list of requirements that would cost more money than Lenora had made in the past month. Fireproof barriers. Ventilation upgrades. Extinguishing equipment. If I do all that, can I keep operating? She asked. If you meet code, yes. And if I don't? Then I shut you down. He gave her 2 weeks. Lenora stood outside the smokehouse after he left, staring at the structure she'd built with her own hands, and felt something close to despair. They were burying her in paperwork, in regulations that hadn't existed until she became inconvenient, in requirements designed not to make her safer, but to make her quit. That evening, Silas found her sitting on the porch steps, head in her hands. He sat down beside her without asking. I heard about the fire marshal, he said. Of course you did. Whole town probably knows by now. Half the town, maybe. The other half doesn't care. Lenora laughed, but it came out bitter. That sounds about right. You going to make the upgrades? I don't have the money. I could. Don't. Silas went quiet. Then carefully, he said, There's another option. What? Let me hire a lawyer, not to pay your way out of this, to fight the eviction notice. Prove Rusk's claim is fraudulent. Lenora shook her head. I already told you. I know what you told me, and I'm telling you that pride is a terrible reason to lose your home. It's not about pride. Then what is it about? She looked at him, trying to find words for something she'd never been able to fully articulate. When my husband left, she said slowly, I had nothing. No money, no prospects, nothing but 2 boys and a cabin I couldn't maintain. And I survived. I did laundry. I took charity I hated. I made myself small enough that people would leave me alone. And every single day I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way to stand on my own. She gestured at the smokehouse. This is me standing. This is me building something that's mine. And if I let you pay for lawyers, if I let you solve this for me, then it stops being mine. It becomes something you gave me, and I can't. Her voice broke. Silas didn't move, didn't try to fix it, just sat there. I can't live like that again, Lenora finished quietly. I can't build my life on someone else's foundation and hope they don't walk away. I'm not walking away. You don't know that. Yes, I do. The certainty in his voice made her look up. Silas met her eyes. I know what it's like to lose everything, To have the ground fall out from under you and realize nothing you built matters because the only thing holding it together is gone. And I know what it's like to stop caring if the ground comes back." He paused. "But I also know what it's like to find a reason to care again. And you and your boys, this place, you're that reason. So I'm not walking away. Not because you need me to stay, but because I need to." Lenora didn't know what to say to that. Before she could figure it out, Caleb called from inside. "Mama, someone's here!" She stood, wiping her eyes quickly, and turned to see another buggy approaching. Not the lawyer this time, the sheriff. Sheriff Hastings was a broad man with a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather. He'd been sheriff for 15 years, which meant he'd been sheriff long enough to know when to enforce the law and when to look the other way. He climbed down from the buggy slowly, like a man who didn't want to be there. "Mrs. Cade," he said. "Sheriff, I need to serve you with an official notice." He held out a document. "Eviction proceedings? You've got 28 days to vacate the property." Lenora took the paper. It felt heavier than it should have. "This is a mistake," she said. "Maybe, but it's legal, I checked." "You checked with who? Rusk's lawyer?" Hastings' expression flickered. "With the land office." "The same land office that won't let me see my own records?" "Mrs. Cade, I don't make the laws. I just enforce them. Even when they're being used to steal someone's home?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "If you think the claim is fraudulent, you need to take it up in court." "With what money? With what lawyer?" Hastings didn't have an answer for that. He just tipped his hat, climbed back into his buggy, and left. Lenora stood there, holding the eviction notice, feeling the walls close in. Silas stood beside her. "Let me help." "I can't." "Lenora, I said I can't." She walked inside, laid the notice on the table, and stared at it until the words blurred. 28 days. 4 weeks to figure out how to fight a man with lawyers, money, and influence. 4 weeks to prove she deserved to keep something that should never have been in question. 4 weeks to do the impossible, or lose everything. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cabin burning, the smokehouse torn down, her son standing in the road with nowhere to go. By morning, exhaustion had settled into her bones like an ache, but she got up anyway, tended the fire, prepared meat, set up the roadside stand, and when customers came, she served them with a smile that felt like it was held together with wire. One of those customers was a man named Thomas Brennan. He owned a restaurant in the next county over and had been buying from Lenora for the past 2 weeks. "Mrs. Cade," he said, "I wanted to talk to you about increasing my order." "How much more do you need?" "Double what I've been getting, maybe triple if you can manage it." Lenora calculated quickly. "That's a lot of meat." "I know, but people are asking for it specifically. Your spice blend, whatever you're doing, it's something special." For the first time in days, she felt something other than fear. "I can do triple," she said, "but I'll need a week to prepare it." "That works. I'll pay up front if that helps." He counted out money, more than she usually made in a month, and handed it to her. Lenora stared at the bills in her hand. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you. I'm not being generous here. This is good business. You're going to do well, Mrs. Cade." After he left, Lenora counted the money 3 times. It still wasn't enough for a lawyer, but it was enough to make the fire marshal's upgrades. It was enough to keep fighting. She worked through the next week like a woman possessed. She smoked more meat than she'd ever attempted at once. She barely slept, barely ate. Caleb helped when he could, but mostly he watched his mother with increasing worry. "Mama, you need to rest." "I will. After." "After what?" "After I prove I'm not going anywhere." On the 7th day, she delivered Brennan's order personally. He inspected the meat, tasted a sample, and smiled. "Perfect," he said. "Same time next week?" "Same time." She rode home with empty crates and a full purse, feeling something close to hope. Then she saw the smoke. It rose from the direction of her cabin, thick, black, wrong. Lenora kicked her horse into a gallop. By the time she reached the property, flames were eating through the smokehouse. The structure she'd built with her own hands, that had represented everything she'd fought for, was collapsing in on itself in a roar of heat and sparks. Caleb and Finn stood in the yard, faces streaked with soot and tears. We tried to stop it, Caleb said, his voice breaking. We tried. Are you hurt? Lenora demanded. No, but then you did everything right. She dismounted and ran toward the flames, but the heat drove her back. There was nothing to save, nothing to do but watch it burn. People started arriving, neighbors, townspeople. They stood at a distance, watching, whispering. Nobody helped, nobody moved. They just watched her life burn like it was entertainment. Lenora stood there, smoke stinging her eyes, and felt something inside her break. Then she heard hoofbeats. Silas rode up fast, dismounted before his horse fully stopped, and took in the scene with a single look. His face went hard. He turned to the crowd. Who saw this start? Silence. Someone set this fire, Silas said, his voice cutting through the crackle of flames. Someone saw it. Who? More silence. Silas's jaw tightened. You people stood here and watched, which means you saw something. So who was it? A woman in the back, Mrs. Clemens, who ran the boarding house, shifted uncomfortably. I saw some men earlier, she said quietly. Didn't recognize them. They were poking around the property. What did they look like? I don't know. It was far off. But you saw them. I saw something. Silas looked ready to tear the crowd apart with his bare hands. Then Finn spoke. His voice was small, confused, cut straight through the tension. Why does everybody hate my mama? The question hung in the air. Nobody answered. Finn looked around at the gathered faces, tears running clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks. She doesn't hurt anybody, he said. She just makes food. Why do you hate her? Still nobody spoke. Lenora felt something crack wide open in her chest. She'd known the town judged her, knew they whispered, knew they looked down on her for being poor, for being abandoned, for surviving in ways that made them uncomfortable. But hearing her 7-year-old son ask why they hated her, hearing the genuine confusion in his voice, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. One by one, people in the crowd looked away. Mrs. Clemens first, then others. Shame spreading like a stain. Silas looked at them with disgust. You should all be ashamed, every single one of you. Then he turned to Lenora. Come on, get the boys. You're staying at my place tonight. I don't care. Your smokehouse is gone. Your cabin isn't safe, and whoever did this might come back. Lenora wanted to argue, wanted to plant her feet and refused to be driven from her home. But Caleb was shaking, Finn was crying, and the fire was still burning. All right, she said quietly. They gathered what they could, clothes, the tin box with the deed, the money she'd earned. Silas loaded it all into his wagon while Lenora held her sons close. As they rode away, she looked back at the cabin silhouetted against flames and smoke, and she made a promise. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Silas's ranch sat 3 miles north of Red Hollow, past the point where the road turned from packed dirt to loose gravel, and the landscape opened up into something that looked almost generous. The house was larger than Lenora expected. 2 stories, painted white years ago but fading now to the color of old bone. There was a barn, a stable, corrals that stretched toward distant fence lines. It looked like the kind of place where a family should live. Instead, it was just Silas. He helped them down from the wagon, carried their few belongings inside, and showed them to a room upstairs with 2 beds and windows that actually had glass in them. I'll be downstairs if you need anything, he said. Lenora nodded, too tired to argue, too tired to feel anything except the weight of everything that had just burned. The boys climbed into one bed together without being told. Within minutes, Finn was asleep, his face still smudged with soot. Caleb lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Mama? He said quietly. Yeah? Are we going to be okay? Lenora sat on the edge of the bed. She wanted to say yes, wanted to promise him that everything would work out, that they'd rebuild, that the fire was just a setback. But she was so tired of lying. I don't know, she said. Caleb turned to look at her. What are we going to do? I'm still figuring that out. Maybe Mr. Mercer can help. He's already helped too much. He doesn't seem to mind. Lenora smoothed the blanket over her sons, tucking it around their shoulders even though the night was warm. Get some sleep, she said. She left them there and went back downstairs. Silas was in the kitchen, setting out bread and cheese on the table. He glanced up when she entered. You hungry? No. You should eat anyway. I should do a lot of things. He pulled out a chair. Sit. Lenora sat, not because she wanted to, but because standing felt like too much effort. Silas pushed a plate toward her, then sat down across from her with his own. They ate in silence. The bread was good, fresh, probably from the bakery in town. The cheese was sharp and crumbly. Lenora chewed without tasting any of it. After a while, Silas said, "That fire wasn't an accident." "I know. You know who's behind it?" "I can guess." "Rusk." Lenora nodded. "He wants me gone. Legal tactics weren't working fast enough, so he moved to the next option. Arson's a crime. So is fraud, but that hasn't stopped him." Silas's jaw tightened. "We need to prove it." "How?" "We don't have witnesses. We don't have evidence. All we have is a burned smokehouse and a list of people who won't talk." "Mrs. Clemens saw men on your property. She saw something. She doesn't know who they were. And even if she did, you think she'd testify against Rusk? He owns half the businesses in this county. Cross him and you lose everything." Silas leaned back in his chair. "So what's your plan?" "I don't have one yet." "You always have a plan. Not this time." Lenora looked at her hands, at the calluses and burns from years of washing clothes and tending fires. "This time I'm just trying to figure out how to keep my sons from being homeless." "You're not going to be homeless. You can stay here as long as you need. That's not a solution. It's a roof. It's your roof, not mine." Silas rubbed his face, frustration bleeding through his usual calm. "Why do you fight every offer of help like it's an insult?" "Because it is an insult to think I can't take care of myself." "Nobody thinks you can't take care of yourself, but sometimes taking care of yourself means accepting help when you need it." "I don't need it. Your smokehouse just burned down." "I'm aware." "Then accept help." "No." They stared at each other across the table, stubborn and exhausted, and neither willing to give ground. Finally, Silas said, "You know what I think? I'm sure you're going to tell me. I think you're so used to surviving alone that you've forgotten how to let people stand beside you. I think you've built walls so high that nobody can get close enough to hurt you again. And I think you're about to lose everything because you're too proud to admit you can't win this fight by yourself." The words hit harder than Lenora wanted to admit. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. "I know enough. I know your husband left and you convinced yourself that meant you had to be strong enough to never need anyone again. I know you'd rather starve than ask for help, and I know you're raising two boys who are watching you destroy yourself trying to prove something that doesn't need proving." "And what's that?" "That you're worth something." Lenora stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "I need to check on my sons," she said, and left before he could see her face. She made it halfway up the stairs before the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, furious crying that felt like it had been waiting years to get out. She sat on the steps and let it happen. After a while, she heard footsteps below. Silas appeared at the bottom of the stairs but didn't come up. "I'm sorry," he said. Lenora wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "For what?" "For pushing. You've been through enough tonight." "I'm fine." "You're not. And that's all right." She looked down at him. "Why do you care so much?" Silas leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You remember when I told you about my wife and daughter? About how they died?" "Yes." "What I didn't tell you was that it was my fault." Lenora went still. "We were traveling," Silas continued, his voice flat and distant, "coming back from visiting her sister. I was driving the wagon. There was a storm, rain, mud, the road was bad. I should have stopped, should have waited it out, but I wanted to get home, thought I could make it." He stopped, swallowed hard. "The wheel caught in a rut. Wagon tipped. My daughter, she was 6, she fell, hit her head. My wife tried to catch her and the wagon rolled over them both." Lenora couldn't find words. "They died while I sat there in the mud," Silas said. "Alive, unhurt. And I spent the next 5 years wishing I'd died with them." "Silas, I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because for 5 years I did exactly what you're doing now. I pushed everyone away, convinced myself I deserved to be alone. Built a life that was just surviving and called it enough." He looked up at her. "Then I rode past your cabin," he said. "And I saw you hanging laundry while your boys played in the dirt. And I saw something I'd forgotten existed, a family trying, a woman fighting. something worth caring about, and I realized I'd been dead for 5 years, and I didn't want to be dead anymore. Lenora's throat tightened. So that's why I care, Silas said quietly. Not because you need saving, but because helping you and your boys is the first thing that's made me feel alive since my family died. And I'm not ready to give that up. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Lenora said, I'm scared. Of what? Of trusting you. Of letting my boys get attached to someone who might leave. Of building something on a foundation I don't control. I'm not leaving. You can't promise that. Yes, I can. People don't leave because they want to. They leave because they have to or because they're running from something. I'm not running anymore, and I don't have anywhere else to go. Lenora wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself trust that this time this man might actually stay. But trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. I need to sleep, she said. Silas nodded. All right. She started up the stairs, then stopped. Silas? Yeah? Thank you. For tonight, for everything. You're welcome. She went to bed but didn't sleep, just lay in the dark, listening to her sons breathe and trying to figure out what came next. By morning, she had a plan. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't safe, but it was hers. She found Silas in the kitchen making coffee. I need to go back to the cabin, she said. He looked up. Why? Because I need to see what's left, what I can salvage. Lenora, there's nothing to salvage. The smokehouse is gone. I don't care. I need to see it. Silas studied her face, then nodded. I'll drive you. They rode back in the wagon, Caleb and Finn in the back, quiet and subdued. When they reached the property, the smell of smoke still hung in the air. The smokehouse was a blackened skeleton. The roof had collapsed inward, the walls were charred and broken, and everything inside, the racks, the tools, weeks of work, was ash. Lenora stood looking at it, trying to feel something other than numbness. Caleb climbed down from the wagon and walked over to stand beside her. We can rebuild it, he said. With what money? The money you saved. From the restaurant orders. Lenora had forgotten about that. The money from Brennan's order was still in the tin box they'd brought with them. It wasn't enough to rebuild everything, but it was something. We'd need help, she said, so we asked for help. From who? Caleb looked at Silas, then back at his mother. From people who want to help. Before Lenora could respond, they heard voices. She turned to see people coming up the road. Not one or two, dozens. Mrs. Clemens from the boarding house, the butcher, Coleman, Thomas Brennan, the restaurant owner, Sarah Pembroke, the banker's wife who'd lectured Lenora about appearances. They came carrying lumber, tools, food. They came on foot and in wagons and on horseback. Silas stepped down from the wagon. What's this? Coleman spoke up, his voice gruff and uncomfortable. We heard about the fire. Figured you could use some help rebuilding. Lenora stared at them. I don't understand. Mrs. Clemens stepped forward. Last night, what that little boy said, it made us think about how we've been acting, how we've been treating you. We're not saying we're saints, Sarah Pembroke added, but we're not proud of standing by while someone's home burns either. So we're here to help, Coleman finished. If you'll have us. Lenora felt something crack open in her chest. Not hope. Something rawer than that. Something that felt like the beginning of belief. I don't have money to pay you, she said. We're not asking for money, Mrs. Clemens said. We're asking for a chance to do the right thing. Better late than never. Lenora looked at Silas. He gave a small nod. All right, she said, let's build. What happened next felt like something out of a story Lenora wouldn't have believed if she wasn't living it. The town descended on her property, like an army. Men tore down what was left of the burned smokehouse and began framing a new structure. Women organized food and water. Children hauled tools and swept debris. Silas directed the construction with the same methodical patience he'd shown teaching Caleb. He measured, cut, explained, corrected. Under his guidance, the building went up faster than Lenora would have thought possible. By noon, the frame was standing. By evening, walls were going up. People worked past sunset, lighting lanterns and continuing by lamplight. Nobody complained. Nobody left. Lenora moved through the crowd in a daze, thanking people, directing traffic, trying to process what was happening. At one point, Sarah Pembroke pulled her aside. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said, "for what I said outside the church about appearances and reputations. It's fine." "It's not. I was cruel and I was wrong. You've been fighting to survive and I lectured you about manners." Lenora didn't know what to say to that. "I'm sorry," Sarah said again. "Truly." Apology accepted. Sarah nodded and went back to work. Late that night, when most people had finally gone home and only a few remained to secure the structure for the night, Brennan approached Lenora. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said. "All right. When you're up and running again, and you will be, I want to double my standing order, and I want to help you expand. Get your product into more restaurants, more towns." Lenora blinked. "Why?" "Because it's good business, and because someone tried to burn you out and I don't like bullies." He handed her a business card. "Think about it. When you're ready, we'll talk." Then he tipped his hat and left. Lenora stood holding the card, trying to reconcile this day with everything she'd believed about Red Hollow, about people, about what help actually looked like. Silas found her still standing there 10 minutes later. "You all right?" he asked. "I don't know. Am I dreaming?" "No." "Then I don't understand what's happening." Silas looked at the half-built smokehouse, at the people still working even though exhaustion lined every face. "People felt guilty," he said. "Finn's question last night. It hit them where they lived, made them realize they'd been complicit in your suffering by doing nothing." "So this is guilt?" "This is conscience, which is better than nothing." Lenora turned to look at him. "You organized this, didn't you? I made some suggestions. They chose to follow them." "Silas, you don't have to thank me." "I'm going to anyway. Thank you." He smiled, quick and almost shy. "You're welcome." Over the next 3 days, the new smokehouse took shape. It was larger than the original, better built, with proper ventilation and fireproofing that would satisfy even the most zealous fire marshal. Lenora worked alongside everyone else, hammering nails and hauling materials until her hands blistered and her back ached. Caleb worked harder than anyone, driven by something Lenora recognized, the need to prove himself useful, to earn his place, to matter. Finn mostly provided entertainment, asking questions and telling jokes and making people laugh when the work got tedious. On the 4th day, they finished. The new smokehouse stood solid and square, built to last. People gathered around it, sweaty and exhausted and smiling. Silas handed Lenora the keys, actual keys with locks, because someone had thought to install security. "It's yours," he said. Lenora took the keys. They felt heavy, important. "Thank you," she said to the crowd. "All of you. I don't know how to repay this." "You don't have to," Coleman said. "Just keep making that smoked meat. We're all customers now." People laughed, started packing up tools, saying their goodbyes. As the crowd thinned, a buggy approached up the road. Not Vernon Price this time. Someone else. The buggy stopped and a man in an expensive suit climbed down. He was younger than Lenora expected, maybe 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather satchel. "Mrs. Cade?" he said. Lenora's stomach tightened. "That's me. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm an attorney from Dallas." Here it comes, Lenora thought. Another legal threat. Another move from Rusk. But Webb's next word surprised her. "I've been looking into your property claim," he said, "and I believe I found evidence of fraud." Lenora went very still. "What kind of fraud?" "The surveyor who originally filed the disputed claim, his name is Chester Yates. He's worked for Gideon Rusk for the past 10 years. I pulled records from other properties along this corridor and found a pattern. Yates files intentionally vague surveys, waits a few years, then claims he made errors. Rusk uses those errors to challenge land titles and force people out." Silas had come up beside Lenora. "How many properties?" "At least 15 that I can document. Probably more." "Why are you telling us this?" Lenora asked. Webb adjusted his glasses. "Because Rusk used the same tactic on my father 3 years ago. Drove him off land he'd worked for 20 years. My father died 6 months later. Heart gave out. And I've been waiting for a case strong enough to take Rusk down ever since." He pulled papers from his satchel. "Your case is strong, Mrs. Cade. Your deed is legitimate. The supposed errors don't exist. And if we can prove Rusk orchestrated this, if we can connect him to the surveyor's fraud, We can not only save your land, we can open the door for everyone else he's stolen from to file suit. Lenora looked at Silas. He was grinning. There's one problem, Webb continued. I need a client willing to fight. This will take months, maybe longer. Rusk has resources. He'll drag this out, make it expensive, make it brutal. You need to be absolutely certain you're willing to see it through. Lenora thought about the cabin, about the smokehouse that had burned and been rebuilt, about her sons and the town that had finally shown up. I'm certain, she said. Webb smiled. Good. Then let's go to war. That night, Lenora sat on Silas's porch, because she was still staying there until the cabin could be made fully livable again, and watched the sun go down. Silas sat beside her, quiet and content. You know, this is just the beginning, he said. Rusk isn't going to go quietly. I know. He'll fight dirty, try to intimidate you, maybe worse. I know that too. And you're still going through with it. Lenora looked at him. You told me once that you rode past my cabin and kept going, that you didn't forgive yourself for that. I remember. Well, I've spent 3 years accepting things I shouldn't have accepted, being quiet when I should have fought, surviving when I should have been living, and I'm done. She turned back to the sunset. So yes, I'm going through with it. Not because I think I'll win, but because I need to know I tried. Silas reached over and took her hand. She let him. They sat like that as darkness fell, two people who'd spent years running from different things, finally learning how to stand still. In the distance, the new smokehouse stood dark and solid against the sky. Tomorrow, Lenora would fire it up, would start smoking meat again, would rebuild the business Rusk had tried to burn down. But tonight, she just sat on the porch with a man who'd refused to leave and let herself imagine, just for a moment, that maybe the war ahead was one she could actually win. Not alone, but with people beside her who'd finally decided to show up. And that, Lenora was learning, made all the difference. Marcus Webb wasted no time. Within a week, he'd filed a formal challenge to the eviction notice and requested a full investigation into Chester Yates's surveying practices. The paperwork landed on the land office desk like a bomb nobody had seen coming. Lenora knew because Vernon Price showed up at her cabin 2 days later, looking significantly less confident than his previous visits. Mrs. Cade, he said, standing on her newly rebuilt porch, I'm here on behalf of Mr. Rusk. I figured. He'd like to settle this matter privately. Lenora crossed her arms. How private? Price pulled out a document. He's prepared to offer you $300 for the property, plus moving expenses. You sign over the deed, drop the fraud investigation, and everyone walks away. $300 was more money than Lenora had seen in her entire life. It was enough to start over somewhere else, to buy security for her sons, to stop fighting a battle that might destroy her. It was also exactly what Rusk wanted. Tell Mr. Rusk I'm not interested, she said. Price's jaw tightened. Mrs. Cade, you should understand that fighting this will be expensive, time-consuming, and you may not win. I'm aware. $300 is a generous offer for land in this area. Then he should have no trouble finding another parcel to buy. Be reasonable. I am being reasonable. This is my land. I have a legal deed, and I'm not selling it to a man who tried to steal it. Price looked like he wanted to argue further, then thought better of it. I'll relay your response. You do that. After he left, Lenora found her hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage that had been building for weeks and finally had somewhere to go. Silas found her in the smokehouse an hour later, working with an intensity that bordered on violence. Price was here, he said. Word travels fast. It's a small town. What did he want? To buy me off, $300. Silas let out a low whistle. That's a lot of money. I know. You turned it down. I did. Good. Lenora stopped working and looked at him. You think I made the right choice? I think you made your choice. That's what matters. $300 could change everything for us. So could keeping your land. Lenora turned back to the meat she was preparing. Rusk's going to come at us harder now. You know that. Let him. Silas, I'm serious. Let him come. We have a lawyer. We have evidence, and we have a whole town that just spent 4 days rebuilding your smokehouse. He's not as powerful as he thinks he is. Lenora wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that the tide had turned, that the fight ahead was one they could actually win. But she'd been disappointed too many times to let hope run unchecked. "I need to get back to work," she said. Silas nodded and left her to it. Over the next month, the legal battle unfolded in ways that felt both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast. Webb filed motions. Rusk's lawyers countered. Documents flew back and forth. Court dates were set, then postponed, then set again. Meanwhile, Lenora's smokehouse business exploded. Word had spread about the fire and the rebuilding. People came from neighboring counties just to buy from the woman who'd stood up to Gideon Rusk. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of solidarity. But they all came. And they all bought. Lenora expanded her operation, hired 2 women from town to help with preparation, built a second smoker, started taking orders weeks in advance because demand outstripped what she could produce. Money came in faster than she knew how to handle. She kept it in the tin box under her bed until Silas convinced her to open an account at the bank. "You're running a real business now," he said. "You need to treat it like one." The banker, Mr. Pembroke, Sarah's husband, was surprisingly helpful. He set up an account, explained how interest worked, suggested she might want to consider purchasing additional property if the opportunity arose. It felt surreal. 6 months ago, she'd been denied credit for a sack of flour. Now a banker was advising her on property investment. Caleb thrived. He took to the business side of things like he'd been born for it, keeping meticulous records of sales, tracking inventory, managing customers with a professionalism that made Lenora's chest ache with pride. Finn, meanwhile, appointed himself the official greeter. He stood at the roadside stand, charming customers, telling stories, making people laugh. Sales always went up when Finn was working, but success brought its own problems. The inspections resumed. Health department, fire marshal, tax assessor. All the same people who'd harassed her before, now with new complaints and new requirements. Webb handled most of it, firing off letters that cited regulations and threatened countersuits. Most of the inspectors backed off after that, but a few persisted, clearly under pressure from someone higher up. Then the threats started. Nothing overt at first, just odd occurrences that might have been coincidence. Supplies that went missing, orders that were mysteriously canceled, a broken window that could have been an accident. But Lenora knew better. Rusk was pushing back, testing boundaries, trying to make her life difficult enough that she'd accept his next offer. The second offer came 6 weeks after the first. Vernon Price returned, this time with a number that made Lenora's head spin. $500, he said, plus legal fees, plus a written guarantee that Mr. Rusk will drop all claims against your property. $500 was enough to change her entire life, to buy a real house, to send her sons to school somewhere that mattered, to stop fighting and start living. It was also surrender disguised as victory. "No," she said. Price looked genuinely surprised. "Mrs. Cade, this is twice what land like this is worth. You're being offered an extraordinary opportunity." "I'm being offered a bribe." "That's not—" "Yes, it is, and the answer is no. You're making a mistake. Then it's my mistake to make." After Price left, Lenora sat on the porch and let herself imagine what $500 could buy. Safety, security, a future without constant fear. But she'd already learned something important over the past few months. Safety bought with surrender wasn't really safety at all. It was just postponing the next fight, and she was done postponing. That evening, Webb came by with news. "We have a court date," he said. 3 weeks from now. Judge Harrison presiding." "Is that good or bad?" "Harrison's fair, doesn't take bribes, won't be swayed by Rusk's money, which means this comes down to evidence." "Do we have enough?" Webb smiled. "We have more than enough. I found 12 other property owners Yates defrauded using the same method. All of them are willing to testify. Plus, I've got documentation showing payments from Rusk to Yates going back 8 years. This isn't just about your land anymore. This is about exposing a pattern of fraud that's been going on for nearly a decade." Lenora felt something loosen in her chest. "You think we'll win?" "I think we have a very strong case, but Rusk's lawyers are good. They'll try to discredit witnesses, challenge evidence, drag things out. So nothing's guaranteed." "When is anything?" Webb laughed. "Fair point." After he left, Lenora found Silas in the barn, checking on one of his horses that had thrown a shoe. "We have a court date," she said. "I heard. 3 weeks. You nervous?" "Terrified." Silas straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've been fighting this for months. You've survived arson, harassment, and 2 attempts to buy you out. 3 weeks in a courtroom should be easy compared to that." "It's not the courtroom I'm worried about." "Then what?" Lenora leaned against the stall door. "What if we win, and it doesn't change anything? What if Rusk finds another way to come after me? What if this never actually ends?" Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Remember when I told you about my wife and daughter? About how I spent 5 years wishing I'd died with them?" "Yes." "You know what finally changed? It wasn't time. It wasn't healing. It was realizing that I could spend the rest of my life running from grief, or I could turn around and face it, build something new even though the old thing was gone. And once I made that choice, once I stopped running, everything got easier." He looked at her. "You're not running anymore either. You turned around. You faced it. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you've already won the important fight." Lenora wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the fight itself mattered more than the outcome, but she was also practical enough to know that losing the court case meant losing everything. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Webb coached her on testimony, on how to answer questions, on what to expect from Rusk's lawyers. Lenora practiced until the words felt wooden in her mouth, until she could recite her story without emotion because emotion made her voice shake. Caleb and Finn knew something big was happening, even if they didn't fully understand the details. "Are we going to lose the cabin?" Finn asked one night. Lenora wanted to lie, wanted to promise him everything would be fine, but she'd promised herself she'd stop lying to her sons. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe." "What happens if we do?" "Then we start over somewhere else." "I don't want to start over. I like it here." "I know, baby. Me too." Caleb, listening from across the room, said, "We're not going to lose. Mama's going to win." The certainty in his voice made Lenora's throat tight. "I'm going to try," she said. "You'll do more than try," Caleb said. "You always do." The night before the court date, Lenora couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table in Silas's house because she'd moved back there temporarily for safety after the window incident, and stared at the documents Webb had prepared. Silas found her there at 2 a.m. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No." He poured himself coffee, sat down across from her. "You want to talk about it?" "Not particularly." "Want to sit in silence?" "That would be better." They sat like that for a while, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional pop from the cooling stove. Finally, Lenora said, "I'm scared I'm going to disappoint everyone." "Who's everyone?" "The town, Webb, you, my sons." "You couldn't disappoint us if you tried." "You don't know that." "I do. Because you've already given more than anyone had a right to ask for. You've fought when most people would have quit. You've built something when most people would have run. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already proven everything you needed to prove." "Have I?" Silas reached across the table and took her hand. "You taught your sons that fighting matters even when you might lose. You showed a whole town what courage looks like. And you reminded me that living is worth the risk of losing." His voice dropped lower. "So yes, you've proven everything, and whatever that judge decides tomorrow, it doesn't change what you've already accomplished." Lenora felt tears prick her eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "Somewhere between losing everything and finding you." She squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you came back. That day you rode past the cabin. I'm glad you turned around." "Me too." They sat like that until sunrise, hands linked across the table. Two people who'd spent years running from different kinds of pain, finally learning that staying still could be its own kind of brave. The courthouse was packed. Lenora arrived with Webb, Silas, and her sons, and found the gallery filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Clemens, Coleman, the Pembrooks, Thomas Brennan, people from town she barely knew but who'd shown up anyway. And in the front row, looking furious, sat Gideon Rusk. He was younger than Lenora expected, maybe 50, with silver-shot hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from expensive granite. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Lenora's entire yearly income, and an expression that suggested he wasn't used to being challenged. His eyes met Lenora's across the courtroom. She didn't look away. Judge Harrison entered, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a bun and glasses that made her look perpetually skeptical. She surveyed the packed courtroom with the expression of someone who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. "This is a hearing regarding the property claim of Lenora Cade," she said. "I've reviewed the filings from both parties. We'll hear testimony starting with Mrs. Cade." Webb guided Lenora to the witness stand. She placed her hand on the book, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. For the next hour, she told her story. The cabin, the deed, the eviction notice, the fire. She answered Webb's questions clearly, factually, without embellishment. Then Rusk's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Dalton, stood for cross-examination. "Mrs. Cade," he said, "you claim your deed is legitimate, but you can't actually prove your husband filed it correctly, can you? The land office has the records. Records that show discrepancies in the surveying. Records that were altered. That's speculation. It's documented. Mr. Webb has evidence." Dalton smiled thinly. "We'll get to that. Tell me, Mrs. Cade, how much did Mr. Mercer pay for your legal representation?" Webb stood immediately. "Objection, relevance? I'm establishing whether Mrs. Cade has the means to pursue this claim independently or whether she's being used by someone with a personal vendetta." Harrison looked at Lenora. "You may answer." "Mr. Mercer helped me find legal representation," Lenora said carefully. "But the claim is mine. The land is mine. And I'm fighting for it because it belongs to me, not because anyone told me to." Dalton pressed. "But you're not paying for this lawsuit yourself." "No. So you're allowing someone else to fund your fight against my client." "I'm accepting help from someone who believes in justice. That's not a crime. Neither is offering to purchase property at fair market value. It is when you're trying to steal it first." Dalton's face darkened. "Your Honor." "I'll allow it," Harrison said dryly. "Continue." The cross-examination went on for another 30 minutes. Dalton tried to paint Lenora as a bitter, vindictive woman being manipulated by Silas. Tried to suggest her business success was built on sympathy rather than merit. Tried to make her look desperate and unreliable. But Lenora had spent 3 years being underestimated. She answered every question calmly, clearly, without rising to the bait. When Dalton finally sat down, looking frustrated, Webb called his next witness, Chester Yates, the surveyor. Yates was a weaselly man in his 40s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He took the stand reluctantly and immediately started sweating under Webb's questioning. "Mr. Yates, you filed the original survey for Mrs. Cade's property 6 years ago. Is that correct?" "Yes. And 3 months ago you filed an amended report claiming there were errors in that original survey." "That's right." "What errors specifically?" Yates fumbled with papers. "Boundary markers were incorrectly placed." "By how much?" "Approximately 30 yards. Webb pulled out a map. "This is your original survey, and this is your amended survey. Can you show the court where the 30-yard discrepancy exists?" Yates studied the maps, his face going redder. The markers they're identical, aren't they?" "No, Mr. Yates, I have testimony from 3 independent surveyors who reviewed both documents. All 3 confirmed there is no discrepancy. Would you like to revise your statement?" Yates looked at Rusk's lawyer. Dalton's face was stone. I may have made an error in the amendment," Yates said finally. "An error? Or were you paid to file a false report?" "Objection!" Dalton shot to his feet. "Sustained," Harrison said. "Rephrase, Mr. Webb." Webb pulled out another document. "This is a bank record showing a payment of $200 from a company called Rusk Holdings to Chester Yates, dated 2 weeks before the amended survey was filed. Can you explain that payment?" Yates's face went white. It was for consulting work." "What kind of consulting?" "General surveying advice." "Mr. Yates, I have 11 other examples of similar payments to you from Rusk Holdings, each followed within days by an amended survey claiming errors in properties Mr. Rusk later attempted to purchase. Are we to believe all of those were also for consulting?" The courtroom went silent. Yates looked at the judge, then at Rusk, then back at Webb. "I want a lawyer," he said. Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. Yates, are you invoking your right to counsel?" "Yes." "Then this testimony is concluded. Bailiff, Please escort Mr. Yates out." As Yates was led away, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Harrison banged her gavel. "Order. Mr. Webb, do you have additional witnesses?" "I do, Your Honor. I'd like to call the other property owners affected by Mr. Yates's fraudulent surveys." For the next 2 hours, people took the stand. Farmers, ranchers, merchants, all with the same story. Yates had surveyed their land, then filed amendments years later claiming errors. Rusk had used those amendments to challenge their claims, force them into expensive legal battles, and eventually purchase their property for pennies on the dollar. By the time the last witness finished, Rusk's lawyer looked like he'd aged 10 years. Harrison called for a recess. Lenora stepped outside with Silas and her sons, trying to process what had just happened. "Did we win?" Finn asked. "I don't know yet," Lenora said, but Webb, emerging from a conversation with the judge's clerk, looked cautiously optimistic. "Harrison's going to rule from the bench," he said. "She won't drag this out. We should know today." An hour later, they were called back inside. Harrison surveyed the courtroom with an expression that gave nothing away. "I've reviewed the evidence presented," she said, "and I've come to a decision." Lenora felt Silas's hand find hers under the table. "The amended survey filed by Chester Yates contains no substantive differences from the original document," Harrison continued. "Furthermore, the pattern of payments from Rusk Holdings to Mr. Yates, combined with testimony from multiple affected property owners, suggests a coordinated effort to defraud landowners through falsified surveying reports." She looked directly at Rusk. "Mr. Rusk, I'm issuing an injunction against any further attempts to claim Mrs. Cade's property. Her deed is valid and will remain so. Additionally, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation into surveying fraud." The courtroom exploded. Rusk stood, face purple with rage, shouting something at his lawyer. Harrison banged her gavel. "Mr. Rusk, sit down or I'll hold you in contempt." Rusk sat, but the fury radiating from him was palpable. Harrison turned to Lenora. "Mrs. Cade, your property is yours. The eviction notice is void. You're free to go." Lenora couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she'd just heard. She'd won. Silas was grinning, Caleb was whooping, Finn was jumping up and down, and Lenora just sat there trying to believe it was real. Outside the courthouse, people crowded around to congratulate her. Mrs. Clemens hugged her. Coleman shook her hand. Sarah Pembroke actually cried. Webb pulled her aside. "The other property owners want to file a class action suit. Go after Rusk for damages. Are you interested?" Lenora thought about it, about dragging the fight out even longer, about spending more months in courtrooms instead of building her business. "No," she said. "I got what I came for. Let someone else fight that battle." Webb nodded. "Fair enough. You've done more than your part." As the crowd dispersed, Lenora found herself alone with Silas and her sons. "We won," Caleb said, like he still couldn't believe it. "We did. What happens now?" Lenora looked at her boys, at Silas standing beside them, at the town of Red Hollow spread out below the courthouse steps. "Now we go home," she said, "and we keep building." That night, back at the cabin, her cabin, legally and permanently, Lenora stood outside the smokehouse and watched smoke drift into the darkening sky. The structure was solid, the business was thriving, her sons were safe, and for the first time in years she felt like she could breathe without something pressing down on her chest. Silas found her there, as he always seemed to. "You all right?" he asked. "Better than all right." "Good." They stood in comfortable silence for a while. Then Lenora said, "I need to ask you something." "All right. Why did you really come back that first day?" "The real reason." Silas thought about it. "I told you before. I rode past and it bothered me. That's not all of it." "No," he admitted. "It's not." He turned to look at her. "When my family died, I convinced myself I didn't deserve to be happy, that moving on would be a betrayal. So I built a life that was just existing. No joy, no connection, no risk, just work and silence and waiting to die." His voice softened. "Then I saw you, hanging laundry, fighting to survive, trying so hard to keep your family together. And I realized that living half a life wasn't honoring my family's memory. It was wasting the life they'd have wanted me to have. So you came back." "So I came back. Because helping you felt like the first real thing I'd done in 5 years, and I wasn't ready to lose that feeling. Lenora felt tears prick her eyes. I'm not good at this. At what? Trusting people? Letting them close? Not pushing away when things get hard? I noticed. She laughed despite herself. I'm working on it. I know you are. And I'm not promising anything. I've been disappointed too many times to make promises I might not keep. I'm not asking for promises. Then what are you asking for? Silas stepped closer. Permission to stay, not as someone trying to save you, not as temporary help, just as someone who wants to be part of what you're building for as long as you'll have me. Lenora looked up at him, at this strange, quiet man who had appeared in her life without warning and refused to leave despite every reason she'd given him. She thought about trust, about risk, about building something new even when the foundation felt uncertain, and she made a choice. All right, she said, you can stay. Silas smiled, really smiled, for maybe the first time since she'd met him. All right, he echoed. He kissed her then, gentle and unhurried, and Lenora let herself fall into it without fear or reservation. When they pulled apart, she said, I'm still not good at this. That's fine. Neither am I. We'll figure it out as we go. That's all anyone ever does. Over the next year, things changed in ways both large and small. The cabin got proper repairs. New windows, reinforced walls, a porch that didn't sag. It started looking less like a structure held together by stubbornness and more like an actual home. The smokehouse business grew beyond anything Lenora had imagined. She hired 4 more people, expanded to a 3rd smoker, started shipping product to restaurants across 3 counties. Thomas Brennan became a business partner, helping her navigate expansion and contracts and all the things she'd never learned. She made enough money to open a bank account that didn't make her nervous, enough to buy Caleb new clothes that fit, enough to send Finn to a tutor who taught him reading and arithmetic because the local school was a joke, enough to stop surviving and start living. The town changed too. Word spread about what had happened in court, about the fraud investigation that eventually led to Chester Yates being arrested and Gideon Rusk losing his business license, about the property owners who finally got their land back or received compensation for what had been stolen. Red Hollow stopped being a place where men like Rusk could operate without consequences, started being a place where people actually looked out for each other instead of just watching each other fall. It wasn't perfect. Some people still gossiped, still judged, still treated Lenore like she was an outsider who'd gotten lucky instead of a woman who'd fought for every inch. But enough people had changed that the rest didn't matter as much. Caleb grew into a young man Lenora barely recognized, confident, competent, full of ideas about how to expand the business. At 14, he started talking about buying his own property someday, building something even bigger than what his mother had created. Lenore encouraged him while also making sure he understood that success wasn't just about money. It was about building something that mattered, something worth fighting for. Finn stayed Finn, enthusiastic, talkative, charming everyone he met. He talked about becoming a performer or a salesman or maybe a politician. Lenora figured he'd probably end up doing all 3. And Silas stayed, not as a rescuer, not as someone fixing what was broken, just as a man who'd found a reason to stop running and had decided that reason was worth everything. He didn't move into the cabin right away. That took time, conversations, careful negotiation of boundaries and expectations and fears. But eventually his things started appearing. A coat on the hook, boots by the door, tools in the shed. One day Lenora realized she couldn't remember what the cabin had looked like before he was part of it. They got married the following spring in a quiet ceremony with just the boys, Webb, and a few friends from town. Nothing fancy. Just vows spoken on the porch of the cabin that had almost been taken from her, surrounded by the life she'd built when everyone told her she couldn't. Afterward, they ate smoked meat and cornbread and berry butter, and Finn gave a toast that made everyone cry and laugh at the same time. It wasn't a perfect day. It rained. The cake fell. One of Silas's cousins got drunk and started a fight with Coleman about politics. But it was real, messy and imperfect, and exactly what Lenora needed it to be. That night, lying in bed beside Silas while rain drummed on the roof, Lenora thought about everything that had led to this moment. The hunger, the humiliation, the fire, the fight. All of it had been necessary. All of it had brought her here. Not to happiness. Happiness was too simple a word for what she felt. To wholeness, to the knowledge that she'd survived the worst and built something worth keeping, that she'd fought when fighting mattered and found people willing to stand beside her when standing alone wasn't enough. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked in the darkness. "How far we've come." "We've come pretty far." "You ever regret it? Coming back that first day?" "Never. Not even when I was being stubborn and difficult." "Especially not then," Lenora laughed quietly. "Why not?" "Because stubborn and difficult meant you weren't giving up. And if you'd given up, I'd have missed all of this." "All of what?" He gestured vaguely at the room, the cabin, everything beyond it. "This. A reason to wake up, a family, a home, everything I thought I'd lost forever." Lenora rolled over to face him. "You gave me that too." "No, you built that. I just showed up and tried not to get in the way." "You did more than that." "Maybe, but you would have made it without me." "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to." They fell asleep like that, tangled together in the darkness. Two people who'd learned that surviving alone was possible, but living together was better. 2 years later, the roadside smokehouse had grown into something the town started calling Cade and Mercer Smokehouse. It operated out of a proper building now, with glass windows and a painted sign and enough business that people sometimes had to wait weeks for orders. The secret spice blend remained legendary. Lenora still mixed it herself, still refused to write down the recipe, still kept it locked in her head where no one could steal it. Caleb, at 16, essentially ran the day-to-day operations. He hired staff, managed inventory, negotiated with suppliers. He was better at business than Lenora had ever been, and she told him so frequently. Finn worked the front counter when he wasn't at school, charming customers and upselling products with natural ease. He'd started talking about opening a second location someday. Lenora figured he probably would. Inside the restaurant, hanging in a frame on the wall where everyone could see it, was Lenora's deed. The one she'd almost lost, the one that represented everything she'd fought for. Customers often asked about it. "Why frame a deed? What's the story?" And Lenora would tell them, not the sanitized version, the real one, about being abandoned and judged and nearly starved out of existence, about a stranger who came back, about a fire that destroyed everything in a town that finally decided to show up, about fighting a man with more money and power than she could ever hope to match, about refusing to disappear. Some people listened politely and forgot. Others heard something that resonated, that made them look at their own lives differently. And a few, the ones who really understood, would nod and say quietly, "Good for you." Those were Lenora's favorite responses. Not admiration, not pity, just recognition that fighting for what's yours matters, even when the odds say you should quit. Especially then. One afternoon in late autumn, Lenora stood behind the counter and watched her sons work. Caleb explaining something to a new employee, Finn making an elderly woman laugh while he wrapped her order. Silas appeared beside her, wiping his hands on a towel. He'd been in back checking the smokers. "They're good kids," he said. "They are." "You raised them well." "We raised them." He smiled at that. "Yeah, we did." They stood together watching the restaurant bustle with activity, this thing they'd built that was so much more than just a business. It was proof that people could survive the worst and come out stronger, that help offered without expectation could change everything, that communities worked when people decided to show up instead of just watching from the sidelines, that a woman dismissed as poor, abandoned, and worthless could build an empire from nothing but stubbornness and smoked meat. Outside, the autumn sun slanted low across the Texas plains, turning everything gold. And inside, Lenora Cade stood in a restaurant that bore her name, surrounded by family she'd fought to keep, and felt something she'd spent most of her life not believing she deserved. Peace. Not the absence of struggle. Lenora knew there would always be struggles, challenges to overcome, problems to solve, fires to put out both literal and metaphorical. But peace that came from knowing she could handle whatever came next, that she wasn't alone anymore, that she'd built something that couldn't be taken away because it wasn't just land or business or money. It was the knowledge that she'd stood up when standing up mattered, that she'd fought when fighting was the only option, that she'd refused to let the world decide her worth. And that refusal, that stubborn, defiant, impossible refusal to disappear, had made all the difference. Years from now, people would tell stories about the woman who stood up to Gideon Rusk. about the fire that tried to break her and failed, about the town that finally found its conscience. Some of those stories would be exaggerated, some would be simplified, some would miss the point entirely, but the truth would remain, framed on the wall for anyone willing to look. Lenore Cade survived. She fought. She won, not because she was perfect, not because she never doubted or feared or wanted to quit, but because when the world tried to make her small, she chose to stand tall. And sometimes that's all it takes. One person refusing to fall, one family worth fighting for, one smokehouse that became a monument to the simple truth that you don't need permission to matter. You just need the courage to keep building, even when everything burns. Especially then.